This is Lita Curry for Talent Talks, and today I'm talking to Joe Searle from the Santon Coaching Center. Joe is a coach supervisor, and a psychotherapist, and we're going to be talking about the value of supervision to organizations. Joe, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
The first question that I'd like to ask you is, what type of skills should a coach supervisor have?
Okay, I think that first of all, to have some understanding of psychology or psychotherapy theories, or the underpinnings of coaching or behavior change. In the time that I've been training supervisors, I see more and more that a lot of coach trainings don't go to that level of depth. So they often give coaches skills, some level of awareness, maybe academic knowledge, but not necessarily a deeper understanding of the philosophies and the underpinnings to what creates behavior change. And that is often the realm of psychology and psychotherapists, but I think really relevant if you are going to work at a transformational level as a coach. So that's for me, that's the one thing that a lot of coaches lack and need to learn when they train as supervisors. And it's people think supervision is just experienced coaches, so I think there's more to it than simply an experienced coach. It's a lot of understanding of working across models and methodologies. So where a lot of coach trainings focus on a model or a methodology, it's about how looking at a meta level. And then also what we're going to talk about in terms of the impact for organizations is understanding parallel process, or how to recognize what the shadow or what's not being said or what's hidden in relationships in organizations and systems. So an understanding of systems theory and how to create change in systems. And then for me, a huge part of it is self-awareness. So if we work at a relational, transformational level, then as supervisors, as coaches, we really need to be doing the self-awareness ongoingly, working on ourselves. And I think that's another area that coaches aren't necessarily good at. And they should be.
I'd like to follow up on what you mentioned, a parallel process. Can you give us an explanation of what that is?
I'll give you a very simple example of a parallel process that can play out in supervision. Is that if a client comes to a coach and says they don't know what to do, and they're asking effectively the coach to tell them what to do, and underpinning that is anxiety, so lack of trust in my ability or uncertainty, and what I bring to the coach is I'm uncertain, I don't know what to do, and then the coach, through their own anxiety or self-doubt, feels they need to give the client something, an answer, rather than reflecting to the client their own ability to do the work, trusting themselves that the client knows what they need to do, rather than necessarily have to jump in and give an answer. Coach then goes to supervision and says, I'm anxious, I have self-doubt, or I think I need to do more studies, or I don't know how to work with this client. To the supervisor, tell me what to do.
Okay, so that's
the parallel process. So what the supervisor can do is get hooked by their own self-doubt or their own anxiety when they hear a coach saying, I don't know what to do, I need to do more study, or they either model a positive parallel process by simply saying, not necessarily saying you don't need to do something to do, you're reflecting your client's anxiety, but is to trust their coach. Like, who are you as a person? What coach training have you done? How do you trust and know yourself to be okay to work with this person? And in that affirmation, they can shift the relationship, because the coach can then recognize it's only their own anxiety that's showing up, which is reflecting the client's anxiety, which often then mirrors, like, is that a systemic issue? Are we working in a corporate where there's high pressure, expectations, unsaid expectations, individual competitiveness, which feeds into people's anxiety and feeling less than, like an academic environment or as we know, a lot of corporates are individually competitive, so it creates anxiety and fear and uncertainty.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So if we talk about an organization as a system, what is the value that supervision can bring in understanding that system or shifting the system?
Well, if we work with individual clients in isolation as coaches in organizations, we're working with that individual client's relationship with the system, which is often the focus is on the individual. And sometimes on the relationships with line manager, etc., but it's still seemingly an individual relationship and not necessarily an entire organization-wide theme or pattern until all the coaches who are working in the organization come together in a supervision type setting and relationship, which does rely on creating safety first. And then through that, if the same theme is coming up with individual coaches in relationship, then you may have information for the system that's really valuable to look at the shadow. So even though the espoused value might be integrity, we might be finding that in a system, actually, people have a view of they can get away with whatever they can get away with, or, you start to highlight the unspoken rules or culture of the organization, which can then be addressed to support the organization for the benefit of the individuals and the organization.
So what I'm hearing you say is that individual coaches could only see their little part of the system. It's really when they go to supervision that the supervisor, having a meta view of the organization, a meta view of the system, can then identify particularly hidden aspects that might not be in any other way visible. How can an organization use those insights from the supervisor?
Oh, I think first of all, awareness is one thing. So knowing that we have a challenge and we have a shadow side is useful information. And I suppose after that you can then start to look at designing interventions around it, which would probably be working at a team level. Most likely to work at team levels around how do we shift and change this. Because it's a systemic intervention. It has to be some sort of systemic intervention.
If you're going to change the system, it has to take that into account.
But once we know that as a collective of coaches, what we're holding is the shift that needs to happen as we work with our individual clients to socialize what they're each working on. And when I say socialize, either to share, to raise the awareness, to shift the individual relationships around whatever the challenge or the issue is.
Yeah. And that obviously makes the coaching more effective within the context of the system itself. Where have you seen this work well?
To be honest, I've been privileged to be on 2 interventions of that nature, which have had a big impact. Relatively slow. In the one we're working more still on an individual level, trying to persuade the client to socialize the individual coaching, but as a collective of coaches, we're starting to see the shift and the change in the organization. But we're also working with the exco level, so we are working with leaders in the organization, which has a huge impact. And we haven't quite got to the team intervention, but which would make it, for me, a lot more quicker and efficient, but still the client is seeing the value because they continue to invest in the individual work and the shifts that they're seeing. And then previously on a smaller engineering consulting company, we worked as a collective to start to highlight some of the underlying themes and work on a more systemic level. I think that if as business coaches we are aware of the impact on the system, then we're holding the benefit of the organization as well as the individual all the time and starting to see that impact. I suppose I could say I'm working with a team of internal coaches in an organization who are also a part of our HR practitioners, and there's a level of complexity around how complicated it is with the amount of information that they hold as well as being coaches. So they grapple with the confidentiality, but we're now talking about Mark's views that we contract for intent and not necessarily always confidentiality. So we're always working with, improving the system. So if we have information that's relevant and valuable, is to share it. I don't know if I'm going off the tangent here.
No, that's fine. That makes complete sense. So, you're talking about Mark Kahn's work around coaching on the axis.
Yes, yeah. And his view now that confidentiality is, when we're working with teams, is we know people are going to talk about each other. It's the nature of how they process relationships. So if we work with a team or a group, we contract for intention. So that if it's not, so it's not gossip, but the contract is for the intention of the benefit of the relationship. So if you come and moan about somebody in the team to me, I'm holding that my contract is to help you process how you can improve your relationship with that person and what that person is showing up or bringing up for you.
Yeah.
That's so that it's not a negative contract, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah. So like in a way, always coaching.
So then going back to the value that supervision can bring around understanding the system and highlighting those things that are hidden. You're saying that not a lot of people are really buying into that yet. What do you think is stopping organizations from doing that?
Lack of awareness. I think our biggest job as coaches and supervisors is to educate our market as to the value of having a systemic interventional coaching program that's more strategic than just a nice to have for individual mastery or individual investment in talent. It doesn't necessarily at this point recognize the systemic impact that it can have.
So we have responsibilities as coaches, external coaches. We have responsibilities as internal coaches within the organization to highlight these issues and this type of approach.
Absolutely, because I think it's coming. If you look at Peter Hawkins' work, there
systemic
are a few
team
people
coaching
that are becoming aware, and I think it probably, I think it's the development of the coaching industry. So as we become more aware, we are as coaches, as the industry, as the profession grows, we're becoming more aware of the impact. And to be honest, it's not new. This is what's been happening in psychotherapy for many years, and we're now starting to recognize the need for that level of systemic work and understanding in terms of how we are ethical in our work in organizations.
Maybe as a final question, what advice would you give for chief people officers, people in charge of coaching panels in organization, to link into the benefits that they can get from that meta view of a supervisory level?
I think we have to start educating them as to how supervision can add value. Sometimes they don't necessarily have the mandate, so they get a budget because of the lack of understanding and where the coaching buying is coming from in the organization, or the authority for coaching. An HR L&D person may have a budget for some coaching, but it's given to her by the CFO based on some sort of strategy. We think we should invest in talent, so let's give each of those talent people a coach without necessarily looking at the bigger picture of the impact, because they also don't know the unintended consequences of just throwing a few coaches at individuals in an organization without having a strategic view of the impact that coaching can bring to them. So sometimes it's seen as a nice to have or a personal mastery or investing in talent, but for me it's still then relatively isolated. So I suppose another way there is one. I know that there's one Australian Business Standards, they recommend that how you interview a coach is to ask them what personal work do they do, what CPD do they do, what supervision do they do. I mean, I suppose for me that's a starting point, but that's still about individual coaches.
And not necessarily looking at it from a systemic point of view.
Okay.
Great. Jo, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.